Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to be today in Chicago. So I would like to start to share with you some conditions that define Mexico as a country. So first one, we are the 11th largest economy in the world, and we plan to be the 8th in 2050. We are the 9th most visited country in the world, with 7th largest car producers, with more than 300 aerospace companies related. We produce up to the detail of the engine of the Dreamliner, the most sustainable commercial plane on the planet. And in summary, we are one of the most biodiverse countries in the planet that has created an amazing richness of culture and architecture. And I want to start with this picture that represents how Mexico City has grown. This is Teotihuacan, Tenochtitlan, next to the lake of Texcoco, 5 centuries ago. And here in this animation, you see how the lake has been dry and how Mexico City has grown the last century. You will see on red the current airport with 2 runways. And we have been selected, the main architects, to develop the new airport of Mexico City. This new airport will have 3 runways on parallel. It's an investment of $10 billion. We currently start the construction of the terminal. It's a building for 67 million passengers. And it's a building that celebrates the history of our architecture, from Teotihuacan to colonial architecture, up to modern architecture like Anthropology Museum by Ramirez Vasquez on your right. Our architecture has always celebrated monumentality. This is the central space of the airport. Here we have all the retail with a span of 180 meters. It's the space you encounter after you pass security. We arranged the design of the project in the X that is so representative for Mexico, but also the most efficient way to organize 95 gates of direct contact of the planes. For us was the opportunity to create the Gate of Mexico. This is the 2nd largest airport on construction in the planet, and outside of the United States, it's the single airport that will have 3 runways that can operate simultaneously. A small animation that enables us to see the interior. Part of the challenge of the architecture is how we can create actually an extraordinary piece of architecture that is not only efficient in terms of its function, but also sustainable and very responsible with the environment. So this will become the first LEED Platinum airport in the world. And in order to do that, we work with the best engineers in the world, to combine with the best local architects and engineers, to develop a system that enables us to build the project with the same principle of compensation that enables a ship to float on the ocean. This principle is created with the idea that if you have enough surface of contact, and if you can balance the weight of the building with the surface that you are getting out of the land, you will create a balance of the structure. We define the structure also by having the same principles of gravitational points that will enable us to have the most efficient spans and the most efficient geometrical conditions in the structure. Each of these mega columns, 21 actually, will enable the building to breathe and to bring the natural air and then inject it through the slabs. It's the first building that has been developed in BIM 400 model in the history of our country, and is the result of more than 500 architects and engineers that has been working in Madrid, New York, and Mexico in the development of this project. We are convinced that we want this project because we saw the opportunity to create the new Gate of Mexico, but also to understand that infrastructure is not only about solving quantitative problems, but also that architecture has that quality that if you exploit it, then you can create symbols, and then you can create an architecture that has a higher relevance that are not only solving quantitative problems. And in this animation, the last one I show of this project, you can see that at the end, infrastructure is about an investment to the future. So we are very proud of the project because this project will enable to boost the economy and the development of all the country. And this is only one project, the most important, but one project among a series of projects that in the country we have been developing. The next project I want to share with you is Hyperloop. We are currently working in the notion of having the most sustainable transportation that can connect the center of the country. So we are in the shortlisted of an international competition. We are one of 30 teams selected among 2,500 teams in the world. And what we proposed was to connect the center of Mexico, the area that we have the highest growth. And the challenge of Hyperloop is that it's still far away technology 10 years from now, but it's the most efficient in terms of time because it can travel up to 1,000 kilometers per hour, but also the most efficient in terms of cost. So how is this achieved? Is basically because Hyperloop is moved with the most sustainable energy in the universe, that is the magnetic energy. So you can travel up to 1,000 kilometers per hour, but the energy you require to move is the smallest in comparison to the rest of the transportation elements. So what we want to connect is Mexico City, Querétaro, León, and Guadalajara. Combined create a population of 30 million people. It's a distance of 500 kilometers that we can develop in connection in less than half an hour. And what is interesting is also that Mexico has all these technologies to actually build effectively Hyperloop, because we have very educated engineers. Up to 100,000 go out of school every year. And we create solar panels, and we create concrete, and we create steel. So all the fundamental elements to build this type of infrastructure are coming from our country. So here you see the aerial map where we have Mexico City up to Guadalajara. And the challenge of the project is then how you connect to the infrastructure of each of these cities. So it needs to be a straight line, but at the same time needs to have a secondary system that connects with the system of each of these cities. So for example, in the case of Mexico, of course, we need to connect it with one of the biggest markets in the world, that is La Merced, where we organize all the goods of Mexico City, but at the same time to connect it through Mexico Airport and then up to the ring inside the city. Here you see the principle. So we have two tubes in two different directions. The tubes are elevated with columns that can be produced in concrete. These elements are try to use the lines of electricity, because this is the path that you have in a straight line usually in each of the continents. And what is interesting of this technology is that it's something for the future of Mexico, maybe 10, 15 years time. But what we see is also the second phase. The second phase will be to connect to the border of the United States, and of course, try to connect also our Gulf of Mexico to Pacific, so that we can use the phase one to connect to our ports. And this brings me to the border. So I have been always fascinated with the border between Mexico and the United States. In 2001, I designed this bridge that was a celebration for the mutual relationship between the two countries. But also I developed this book that was a research of the most relevant data between the two countries. And I tried to understand what makes this border so extraordinary. One of the most active borders in terms of human crossings, but also in terms of economy. The city has been developing through sister cities. Of course, one of the news that we always read in newspapers is related with trade, but also the challenges that we have, of course, in terms of the drug traffic that has defined the agenda of security in this border. What is interesting to see is also how many people in the next decades are going to be moving to cities. So we'll have more than 2.5 billion people living in cities. 37% of that population will be only in 3 countries, India, China, and Nigeria. And the trend is that bigger cities are not going to grow, but the trend is that new cities, smaller cities, are going to grow. Of course, slums, I think, is part of the agenda, how people self-build their own homes. Only in Latin America, we have 100 million people living in buildings that they build their own selves. And of course, adding that complexity is the wars, Middle East wars, and global warming that creates also all the refugees that already in the last decades has created a movement of $5 billion investment in that agenda. So all of these aspects make us analyze and make us interested always in this agenda of the border. I show this image because we are convinced that rather of doing walls, we need to think in new ways to create integration. We are convinced that the challenge is China. So, thank you. We have been convinced that the challenge for the United States is China, but it's not Mexico. Mexico has been always a great partner, a great ally, and NAFTA numbers is the best proof for that. It has worked extraordinarily well for both countries. We have been interested in the border as an experiment of possibilities, and recently, the last year, we have been invited by 3 owners of land in Mexico and the United States to develop a new master plan for doing the first binational city. So in the side of North America, next to El Paso, they have already built this train infrastructure that will connect to all North America. You see in red represented the surface is 4 times Manhattan. And I work with a group of experts with the New York Bureau Happold to try to plan a city that can create almost like a laboratory of social development, but also a laboratory where you can try to explore some of the aspects that make clear the concepts of a mutual relationship between the 2 countries. So we went to analyze all the urban grids along the history and then tried to understand the essence of how we can develop the city. So we went from the concepts of radial that celebrates centrally to the radial grid to the hexagon. So the hexagon is interesting because it can also help us to have clusters thematically oriented. So what we developed the city was based on the idea that those clusters, I need to go a bit faster now in the last moment, but those clusters are going to be celebrating different contents of the program. So here you see the master plan where you have a main road that already exists. The center of the city will have the border crossing that already exists between the 2 countries. Here you see the industrial area already in operation where Foxconn is already creating iPhones, where they are doing pre-clearance on the side of Mexico. So it's the beginning of a small laboratory that can become the future of how the border can work more effectively. So here again, the clusters, the idea of the connectivity, how you expand the grid that makes you a flexible city enough that can grow organically. Health is a very important aspect of how America can have a lower cost services in Mexico. Again, this vision of having a mixed program city for the future. I just want to end up with maybe 2 pictures. This is the vision of very sustainable transportation, to have not very expensive infrastructure, but rather trains at floor plan. And finally, this image that represents the vision, where you see the border in the limit. And we think that this is probably too early to be discussed today, but it's a project that soon will be a very natural step, I think, with the technology that civilization is developing. And to end, I just want to show this image. So it's the airport that is proving that we are building some of the best infrastructure in the world. We are thinking in the new projects, such as Hyperloop, in terms of being more competitive as a country. We think that we need to rethink how we develop and plan cities. But more especially, we are the generations that will arrive to Mars. And we need to take that same intelligence and that same level of resources to try to imagine more effective, more efficient, more sustainable cities where millions of people will live in the future. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here.